Judges chapter 7, starting at verse 1. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go, but if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water, and the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps, from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterwards you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah his servant went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into our hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. "Watch me," he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all round the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle of the watch. Just after they had changed the guard, they blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" While each man held his position round the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth Shittah towards Zererah, as far as the border of Abel Maholah near Tabath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. When I sort of first felt God leading me to a series on the life of Gideon, I hadn't realised quite how it was going to build into a series of sermons, kind of helping to answer some of the big questions in our life as God's people. We began by asking the question, is God's church in hiding today? We've looked at how Christians can have assurance that they are right with God. Last week we looked at, is God really calling me to that work? How can I test what God might be calling me to? But now we look at what is quite often our response to that call. When God calls us to work on something, to do something, and our response can so often be, but I'm too small, too weak, not powerful enough for that particular work. We also see in this passage God's answer to that. We see why God deliberately chooses some who are smaller and weaker. We read last week that Gideon sounded the trumpet and called the people of the northern tribes of Israel. And they came in their thousands. 32,000 people came ready for war against the Midianites and the other eastern nations who had assembled to attack God's people. But verse 2 is such a key verse in understanding how God can use us to do amazing things for him. God said to Gideon, you still have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands. Why? Because Israel would boast against me. They would boast, my own strength has saved me. So if God had allowed the 32,000 Israelites to attack the enemy, they'd have gone home singing their own praises. They'd have gone home saying what a great, mighty and powerful and wonderful nation Israel is. Aren't we amazing? And that wasn't what God wanted. He wanted them to learn those great lessons that we need to learn as God's people. That it's him who gives the victory. It's to him that all the praise belongs, not to us. I see a great parallel here with this nation and its attitude towards the Second World War. During the Second World War, the king called on this nation to pray. He called for a national day of prayer for protection when the invasion looked imminent. The RAF were fighting in what became known as the Battle of Britain. Later on, he called the nation to pray again for victory as the Allied forces prepared for the Normandy invasion. The nation turned to God in those hours of great need. But ask people around the country, to whom do we credit the victory today? And so many people will tell you that the Battle of Britain, yes, it was won by superior pilots and better planes. Why were the planes better? Well, because they were British, of course. Victory in Normandy, it was down to the heroic fighting spirit of the British people. The whole narrative of the war in this country is that the French surrendered, the Americans were late, but Britain stood alone against the Axis nations. They choose to forget that actually we were never alone. We were part of a massive empire. And people from all the empire nations came and joined and supported and fought alongside the British. Those same people will watch the Battle of Britain and hurrah at the great British pilots, not even noticing the incredible part that Czech, Polish and Canadian pilots played in the Battle of Britain. They forget that in Normandy, actually it was Americans who provided the majority of the forces and took the majority of the casualties. And people, most of all, People forget that they had prayed and beseeched God for his protection and for victory in those days. Before the Battle of Britain, the people prayed, and the Luftwaffe inexplicably changed tactics just when they could have won that air battle. Before D-Day, they prayed, and a miraculous weather window opened up for the D-Day landings. God gave the victory in answer to prayer, but people sought glory for themselves. No, God says, I will not share my glory with another. God knows what people are like. He knows that we plead with him for protection and then take the glory on ourselves for the victory that we're given. And so God says to Gideon, God understanding what the people of Israel were like, he said to Gideon, no, you've got too many people. They're going to boast that their own strength saved them. No. Get rid of most of them. He whittled down 32,000 to just 300. 1/100th of the fighting force was finally used. He whittled them down so that it was obvious that the victory was miraculous. Israel couldn't claim that their own strength had saved them. They couldn't steal God's glory. One of the worst things that humans can do, stealing God's glory. They weren't able to do that because God has saved them with so few people. This victory had to be all about God. So when God calls you to a task and you think, can I really do that? Can God really achieve this thing through somebody as small and as weak and as inexperienced and as unskilled as me? The answer is yes. God has chosen you specifically because of who you are so that he will get the glory through you. God can use you to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Not in spite of your inability to explain things clearly or your lack of confidence. No, he can use you to share the gospel of Jesus Christ because of those things. He can use you to teach children because you don't think you're any good at it. He can use you to lead outreach because you know that you can't do it on your own. He can use a small church like this one because we are small and apparently weak. It's that way he gets the glory. There's an estate out there that needs to be evangelized. You know, God could use one of the big city centre churches. He could use City Gates, couldn't he? With all your massed numbers that you've got there and all the people. God says, no, I want to use you little lot. Sitting there. Because there's not many of you, because you're under-equipped. I want to use you to take the gospel to those 1,000 homes. Because you are small in number. Because you're weak. That way it's clear it's a miracle of God and he will get the glory. Do you know, after calling us, God graciously allows us to see the victory. Remember back in chapter 6, verses 36, 37, Gideon asked for a sign from God that he really would be used, that God really would use Gideon to give the people victory. And God gave him a sign. And then in verses 39 to 40, he gave him another sign. But God still wasn't done. He knew that Gideon required assurance. So he sent Gideon down to go and listen to the conversation that was taking place in the Midian camp. And after hearing one of the soldiers explaining a dream and then his companion recognizing that the dream meant that God's army under Gideon was going to have the victory, Gideon was finally assured. He'd seen the end. He'd seen where this was leading, to victory for God's people. He'd graciously allowed Gideon a little peek into the future. And God says to us, if you ever doubt the power that is at play in you, If you ever doubt where you stand with me, if you're not sure about where things are ultimately leading, I'm going to give you a little peek into the future. Just go and read the book of Revelation. And let me give you a little peek of how things are going to end. See the great victory that is guaranteed for God and his people. Because in the book of Revelation, God gave the Apostle John a vision to see how history would end, where the church of God would spend eternity. And John saw Jesus, now in heaven, worshipped as the true God and King of all humanity. And he saw Jesus in heaven destroying every enemy of God's people and reigning with his people in a perfect new kingdom for eternity. See, Jesus died on a cross to pay for the sins of his people. And the Bible tells us that everybody who comes to Jesus, recognizing that they are a sinner who needs forgiveness, who comes accepting Jesus as their Saviour and setting out to live for him, will be forgiven. The moment that they turn to Christ in that way, they are forgiven for everything they've done wrong, and they're adopted as a child of God. And they belong to his kingdom from that moment and will spend eternity in heaven. See, that is our future. As children of God, that is where it's all going to end for us. Or where it's never going to end for us. That's where we're heading. Our enemies will be beaten. We will be victorious. That end has been shown to John and written in the book of Revelation, and it cannot be changed. It will happen. It is guaranteed. The route to get there may be tough. It may not always look as though we're on the winning side. There's going to be many times when the church is going to look beaten in this world. But the victory is simply being on God's side. It's simply answering the call and being with God. Most of you know that I love cricket, and I've been watching the series that's on with Freddie Flintoff taking young people from Preston out to India. And he was talking to one of the young lads who was ready to give up and ready to go home. And this lad said to Freddie Flintoff, he said, "I don't want to be a failure." And he said to that young lad, he said, what is failure? And the lad said, not being able to do it, I can't remember exactly what he said, but not being able to do stuff for the team. And Freddie said, no, failure is not trying. As soon as you try, you've won. That is victory. Being on God's side is victory. Doing the things that God is calling us to, that is victory. It may not always look like it on this earth. It may look as though so many of the things that we try to do look as though they end in failure. There's going to be times that Revelation tells us there's going to be times when the world is going to think that the church is utterly beaten, utterly dead. But being with God, that is victory. And in the end, we will see that victory from heaven as God destroys every enemy that has ever stood against us. Keep your eyes on the end. Keep your eyes on where it's heading. That is what is going to encourage us to keep working, to keep doing the things that God is calling us to, even though we feel weak and we feel small and we feel incapable. The end is going to be victory in heaven. I read through. Did you notice what the people shouted when they broke the jars? Because I don't think they did what they were told to. 23 years in the military, it won't surprise you. I like people to follow orders, and I don't think they did. Verse 18, Joshua told them, this is what you're to shout: for the Lord and for Gideon. That's what they were told to shout. Verse 20, we see what they shout. Get the charge sheet out. They all disobeyed orders. A sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Gideon had never mentioned a sword. And it's really interesting that they kind of thought that there was a need for swords in there, and that they thought swords are the way to win a battle. And actually, in the end, none of them needed to lift a sword to win this battle. They didn't need to. God won the battle without the need for weapons. We read in Psalm 2 last week that God laughs at those who turn against his people and think that they can defy him. In Revelation, when we read about the end, chapter 17 of Revelation tells us about a woman who rides a great beast and entices the rulers and the rich and the powerful people of earth to follow her ungodly ways. But eventually all of those people recognize that her teaching and her ways are completely hollow, and they turn against her and destroy her. See, the enemies of God eventually turn on each other and destroy each other, exactly like happened here with the Midianites. God laughs at those who oppose his people. He's able to defeat them without his church having to take up a sword. He can cause them to turn on each other, as they will in those end days recorded in Revelation, as they did in the time of Gideon. They didn't need a sword. They just needed to use what they had. Remember back in chapter 6, when Gideon felt that he was too small and weak to lead God's people, and God said, "Go in the strength you have. Am I not sending you?" And that's still the message here in chapter 7. Go in the strength that you have. Go with the numbers I am giving you, with the tools that I am giving you. Go with the 300, not the 30,000. And in this battle, they didn't need to lift a sword or any offensive weapon. They didn't need thousands of soldiers, just a handful of people armed with torches and a faith in God. And God says to us today, go in the strength you have. Go with the tools you have. What tools has God given us? He's given us prayer. He's given us the gospel of Jesus Christ. He's given us the Bible. He's given us one another to support and encourage and to pray for one another. They're the tools you have. Go with that. That's all you need. You've got every single thing that you need in order to achieve this task that I'm giving you. You know, it's so tempting to think that we need a sword. It's tempting at times to think that we need offensive weapons of some sort, when really we don't. Perhaps the weapons, the offensive weapons that we might think of, maybe not swords and spears, but angry words or nastiness and judgmentalism. It's easy to think that we should be angry about the way this nation is rejecting God and teaching our children evil, ungodly ethics. And we're very tempted to go on the attack against that, to call people's names, to try and discredit people who teach those false doctrines. Maybe tempted to turn up at pride events or something similar and shout at people. God says, you don't need offensive weapons. Go with the tools you have. Go in the strength you have. And he's promised us the victory. Remember what victory looks like? Victory means doing what God has called us to do. That is what victory looks like. We are few in number. But we have the gospel of Jesus Christ. The good news of a God who died for us and who rose again and who will take everybody to heaven who repents and puts their faith and their trust in him. We feel weak, but we have the Bible. The word of the Lord, which is sharper than any sword, it tells us. We feel alone, but we're never, ever alone. We have God with us, and he will go with us, and he's promised never to leave us. And God will use us precisely because we feel weak and incapable. It's that way he gets the glory. If we chose to do the things that we were confident at, we'd end up boasting. What does God say? He says, I will not share my glory with another. He'll use us so that he gets every bit of glory that belongs to him. Let's trust him. Let's go in the strength we have. Just obey him and know that he will give us the victory.